the launch of David Wilmoth's The Promise of the City. Alrighty, so this evening, joining David is Dr. John Martin. Firstly, I'm going to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently on, the Jagera and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the lands on which you're all joining us from on Zoom this evening. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Firstly, also a bit of housekeeping. So just with bathrooms, they're just out through the gate there if during presentation.
Just in the back alley, right?
Yeah. And then, so we'll jump to question time at about 7:15 if anyone has any burning questions. And then at 7:30, we'll head inside and David will do a book signing in there. And there's plenty of copies available to purchase. So my last job before you guys kick it off is I'm going to introduce both of you. So I'll start off with Dr. John Martin. Is you all right? Oh, I thought someone was going off the edge there. That's such a fear of mine. Is an emeritus professor from La Trobe University, where he was director of their Centre for Sustainable Regional Communities. He is also the visiting professor at the Australian Centre of Excellence for Local Government in the University of Technology, Sydney. At RMIT, he worked as director of the Centre for Regional and Rural Development at Hamilton and helped establish RMIT University Vietnam. He was executive director of the National Office of the National Local Government Training Council, has a PhD in public policy from ANU, and has held a number of senior academic positions. Like David, John was an AFS exchange student to the USA in the 1960s. Sorry, tongue twisters. Okay. Now, so Professor David Wilmoth grew up in Queensland. He is the director of Learning Cities International, a company advising on education and urban development. He is active in the non-profit and university sectors and chairs academic and museum boards in Australia and Vietnam. He has been a Dean and Deputy Vice Chancellor at RMIT, Head of Division for Planning in New South Wales, Director of National Urban Policy in the Australian Government, and a Company Director, academic and consultant in many countries. He belongs to a number of professional institutes and has degrees and certificates in economics, planning and higher education from the Universities of Queensland, Sydney, California at Berkeley, Melbourne and Harvard. Two very distinguished gentlemen. Yeah. So let's give a round of applause.
Thank you,
guys take it away.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
I wonder, do we need the microphone or can you hear me?
If you wouldn't mind just for Zoom purposes.
Oh, for Zoom,
Yeah.
for Zoom.
We are being joined on Zoom this evening as well. All right, thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor, and look, thank you, David, for asking me to launch his book. I should give you some context first of all, so you understand why I'm here and how we're going to do it. I'm doing a chapter on the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam election, which is being published in December. And my chapter is the legacy of Tom Uren and the Department of Urban and Regional Development. So I'm doing my research and I discovered this David Wilmoth. I worked with David Wilmoth at RMIT and I found him, and we caught up in Sydney in February and we had a chat about DIRD. And one of the things that comes out of the DIRD chapter in the book generally is that David is a fantastic networker. And one of the things that came out of DIRD is it's the diaspora of people who went on to do wonderful things in Australia. Anyway,
There's Hobins here from
some DIRD people here. So we're having a lunch and he talks about his AFS experience. I said, AFS student? When were you an AFS student? And that'll come out in the early part of the book. And so I was an AFS student as well. I went to Seattle and he went to Connecticut, and we were 4 years difference, I think, between us in terms of what we actually did. And when we talk about the book, David has gone on to do lots of things with AFS. I was also a director of the board of AFS in the 90s. And we missed each other then, and then he ended up becoming the chairman.
We have AFS as president.
Yeah, who are our AFS students?
Nick Minchin and Kerry Clark, and Elsa Eckel is online as well.
Really? Look, I won't ask you what year it was. Okay.
I was David's year.
Oh, you were David's year.
And she's in the book. Kerry has a photograph in the book.
With dark hair.
Okay. So Now, in terms of Vietnam, I was involved in Vietnam. I went once with Neil Furlong. I remember. Yes, I was involved in the LRC in Hue. And I did get to go to Hanoi and all those other places. But when you hear what David actually did, my work was very minimal. So the book has 12 chapters. It's listed as a memoir, but it is very autobiographical. For me, the third chapter is very much a memoir. And when he talks about his work with David Wilmoth and all that work you did for 17 years at RMIT, taking it from the Working Men's College to a world-class university, it's really a fabulous story. And I was there and a benefactor of that because I was, as Eleanor introduced you, I was in the Western Districts with a wonderful situation when RMIT was having financial troubles, and I was funded by the Murdoch family to run their Centre for Regional Rural Development. My funds were ring-fenced. So I was very fortunate as an academic in that time to have that freedom. But anyway, let's start with David. Let's start with the beginning. You were born in Mackay.
Bundaberg.
Oh, Bundaberg. Yes, I knew that. You went to Mackay.
Really?
You went to Toowoomba.
Dad was a city engineer.
That's
Bundaberg.
right. Yeah. And Dad, the city engineer, pops up in interesting ways in David's story, which is the autobiographical part of it. And then you went to Churchie, which, for those of you who don't know, is an Anglican boarding grammar school here in Brisbane. And it was a pretty interesting place, which he talks about what these boys got up to. And if you want to read about that, you can. It might be interesting.
Did you talk about smoking in the ceiling?
But I don't talk about what the staff got up to, unfortunately.
No. Did you smoke about the scene prefect?
No,
you didn't.
Well, the interesting thing about whether you want to raise that as an issue, and because it happened, is it Choate as well? Choate.
Yeah.
So he actually he says in the book that he took himself off to be an AFS student. Well, back in the day, you didn't take yourself off to be an AFS student. You were selected, and it was quite a rigorous thing that they went through. I remember when they came to my home to interview me, my sister tipped over the afternoon tip on the selectors, and I was mortified, you know. And you went through several selections and so on. And so they were, as we've come to realise with our AFS returnees who've gone on to do wonderful things, were quite a selected group. And you went to Choate. So my first question is, when you got to Choate, what was your first reaction? What was your view of that place?
Oh, it was another world. It was overwhelming.
What is Choate?
Choate is a US prep school. It's a boarding school in Connecticut. And because I'd been in boarding school in Brisbane, I think they said, oh, we'll put him into a boarding school there. And one thing is I wrote for the newspaper, I wrote a story that was disparaging of Churchie and full of praise for Choate. Oh, we're fenced in, we have to wear uniforms, you know, etc. And Choate had an honour code and an open campus, and you're just wonderfully endowed. You know, Kennedy's and Rockefellers, you know, huge resources around. And the only thing is my mother, bless her soul, I gave it to a friend who was a journalist for the Toowoomba Chronicle and ran the story in the Toowoomba Chronicle. So the headmaster of Churchie took great offence. Harry Roberts, or better known as Buffett. Yes. So he and I had what I would only call it an adult, you know, it was wonderful. We wrote letters to each other through the year about the school experiences in the two schools. So at the end, it worked out okay. Yeah. But that was my first impression. I was just overwhelmed by and as a result, going on a bit, but as a result, when asked for money, I said my year at Choate was absolutely wonderful. But one thing I learned was never to give money to such a rich and privileged institution like Choate. So I went off the mailing list for many years. But they finally put me on it. I figured I did dribble a few little donations.
There's lots in the chapter about his experience at the school. One thing that I was impressed with, because David was a good student and he was in the top 20%, he got weekends off to go to New York City. And in the book, lots of photos, lots of interesting things about what he experienced as a 17-year-old boy from Queensland, from Toowoomba, looking at demonstrations, the Vietnam War, racism, and in the interesting parts of New York City. So did you get yourself into much trouble there?
No, not much at all. I mean, I was quite shocked by the disparities. My family, my host family, the holiday host family, the Overharts, took me to Harlem because they were visiting Barnard College, because my summertime host father was headmaster of a girls' boarding school, and they were cultivating Barnard College, associated with Columbia. And we were there with the fire hydrants and riots in the streets. It was, and we had a big modern car, bang, 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 set with people. It was quite scary. But the only time I got into trouble a bit was that the AFS headquarters closed at midnight. And when I was staying there, I would go out on dates and oh no, it's past midnight. So more than once I turned up at the unsuspecting dates' parents' apartments to stay the night because I couldn't get into the AFS. Of course, it wasn't engineered at all. It just so happened. You know, I just forgot the time.
But when you see the book in its totality, you actually see how these early experiences were extremely influential in terms of his focus, his academic career, and his work in learning cities and in terms of urban development, urban planning and equity and so on. And that clearly comes out in the chapter on DIRD, because the DIRD model wasn't about land use planning. It was about a much bigger picture of how we lived in society and dealing with issues of where you lived, as Whitlam said, mattered in terms of where you ended up. So that was an interesting, so that's a good start to the book. He came back, he went to the University of Queensland, and you had a good time there. The thing that comes out a lot of what David's story, when he did his PhD at Berkeley and so on, he did the academic stuff, but he did all this other stuff, like the Northern California Alliance.
Oh, that was in California.
Yes, I know. I'll come to that. That's chapter 4 or something. But let me there. So he did his undergraduate studies in urban planning and economics. And in the summertime, there's some great photos of him working in tourism. He was a little skinny guy back in those days, and he had putting up the garbage. But the one that I'd like to get to, he had the opportunity to work with a planner called George Clark, and he was one of the owners of a planning firm in Sydney. I think it was.
Yes.
Clark and Gazzard. And what David says in the book, that as we forget to acknowledge our mentors, and they're gone. He says that about George, and he says that about Pat Troy.
Yeah, it's really important. Yeah.
But tell us a bit about George. What was he like?
Oh, he was the most prominent private sector urban planner in the country. And I sort of said, could I work with you? And he said, yes. And so Jill, my then wife, went down to Sydney and worked with him, and also up here. And he was totally self-promotional, but he threw everybody at the deep end, including myself. He over-exaggerated what I could do to clients, which is fairly typical, I suppose, of those sorts of things. But it also made me swim when I was thrown in the deep end a little bit. And he was, the basic project was the city strategic plan, which was a groundbreaking type of plan of its kind, because it was strategic and non-regulatory, and about the vision that there was a civic reform group in power in Sydney who were a little bit like Teals in a way. They were progressive, but their home was the Liberal Party, but they were they ran Sydney in a wonderfully progressive way, and the legacy of those plans is still there. And Jill and I were sort of active in lots of other things in Sydney, but George, when Labor came into power in Canberra, George's circle came. It's an arc, isn't it? It waned a little bit because it was more the circus moved on, and so urban system still stayed strong. And again, the legacy of that group, they're around now in Australia, lots of those.
David and Jill moved to Sydney, and he did an MA in planning at the University of Sydney. He has some interesting views about that department. If you're an academic and you're interested in what the students think about their professors, have a read. But he did the phrase that I got out of the book, which was really interesting, called knowledge in a hurry. And he was interested in then communication, which came out subsequently also with his PhD in Berkeley. Interested in communication and the way we lived and how we communicated. And it was well before the internet. But he was ahead of his time then. Do you still remember that phrase?
I do, yeah. I was looking for a thesis. I was poking around in the dusty cupboards of the planning department at the University of Sydney, and the New York Regional Plan Association did an economic review of the economy of the city of Manhattan, really, not New York, just Manhattan. And they said basically they said the reason for cities is that for us to gather together, communicate. And the reason for high intensity areas like that is knowledge in a hurry, that face-to-face communicate rules, and it pushes out non-valuable communications that can't cluster like that. So I thought, well, that's good. So I actually did the master's thesis on communications technology. And what struck me then, or strikes me now, was that all the stuff that the electronic engineers were talking about in the late 60s and early 70s has come to pass. You know, that the information utility was sketched out in a way that was very present. The only thing was picture phone failed. And I got Tom Uren to have a go in cabinet because the Telecom 2000 was a review about Australia's future communications. So I said, you know, go for it. And then Bob Lansdowne, my department boss, came back and said, David, don't tell anybody this, but the Secretary of Cabinet wants to clarify something that your minister said. And it was, what's an information utility?
Yeah, look, that was in many ways ahead of his time in so many ways, as you would expect when you think about what he had done and what he had experienced up to that time. So David and Jill moved to Canberra. She moved first. She got a job.
Yes, yeah. Tom and Pat Troy recruited her first. I was George.
And what was interesting about Pat Troy, and I saw this as a graduate student and subsequently years later working with him, that the way that he actually networked, you know, really good academics network all the time. And it's a networking about inquiry, about questioning, asking, and you certainly see this in the book in the way in which David worked. He tells the story of people who come into his orbit in terms of what they actually do, but what he does is he actually describes how they help and the way in which they actually work. There's no mean streak in him. He's not derogatory about anyone, but he's a matter of fact about the way he talks about them. I find that really interesting. He's been really helpful with me in terms of following up with people. So there was a three years, busy. And at the end of it, he says himself, he was burned out by the whole thing. But when you go back and reflect on those days, what were some of the key things that came out for you in terms of working in dirt?
Just the power of bravery that people like Pat Troy and Tom Uren to put themselves out and take risks and turn a vision into programs. That struck me. I'm a bit Pollyanna-ish. It's hard to find someone I don't like. So as a result, I'm not very assertive sometimes. And people like Pat Troy most certainly were. You know, they were just wonderful leaders. So that was one thing. The other thing was how important a national view about settlement patterns, population and cities should be. And Bill Alonso from Berkeley, who was there at the time, made a very important distinction between the explicit urban policies of a government and the implicit. Any government has an urban policy, but it's implicit. it's embedded in population and tax and all sorts of housing costs, all sorts of things. And that sort of guided me quite a lot, because any urban policy needs to accommodate itself to all sorts of instruments that are not thought of as urban instruments.
And that was one of the, I think that's one of the lessons from it. It was such a big bite of so many things at the time that it's never resurrected itself since. For my purposes as research, David says the legacy and enduring legacy of Durden. I mentioned a few of them here. The first one he mentions is Alonso's implicit instruments, whole of government attention to urban and regional affairs, a more holistic view of what makes good urban and regional development. Tom Uran, everything's connected to everything. Federal and state recognition of the interconnectedness of investment decisions. The challenges that they had working with states was enormous. Queensland didn't play.
Not at all.
Not at all.
And yet Queensland, regional organisations, the council in Queensland have been picked up well
Yes.
and enthusiastically,
Yes, yes.
even though Queensland wouldn't play. Nor would Western Australia for most of it.
Yeah, and many of those early structures have come to pass, such as regional councils and so on. Acceptance of the economic role of cities and the importance in government budgets and infrastructure. A more sophisticated view of territorial justice and the entrenchment of forces opposing redistribution. A deeper understanding of the intergovernmental character of city planning and development. Continued acceptance of the merits of regional cooperation, especially amongst local councils, which is where I work. Currently working with the Inner West Council. Do you know the Inner West Council? In Sydney, they had a poll at the last election in December last year to de-amalgamate Camperdown, Marrickville and Leichhardt. And all the citizens, 80% of them were getting some nods, said yes, we want to de-amalgamate, but the Labor Party came to power and said no, this is in the council, we won't have a de-amalgamation. So these politics go on all the time around Australia. They surface in some places, and we as academics are fortunate at times to be involved, but mostly we don't see what goes on and people don't talk to each other. DIRD tried to do that through their area improvement programs, the regional and so on. And so this was really a great chapter for me. And for anybody involved in urban planning, I mean, it should be, are you still teaching at New South Wales?
Oh, no, we didn't have the numbers to reach their... all the universities have put up their minimum numbers on master's programs.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is where something like this would be of great value. And I just, when you read what David actually did in terms over those 3 years was enormous. And not only that, John Patterson's Michael Keating went on to be Secretary of the Treasury. The diaspora, PM&C, I'm sorry, PM&C was fantastic.
Could you find some bad points? I think all these are some bad points. You're just praising too much. It's not the rounded person.
So now, okay, well, in burnout, he got divorced.
Okay, that's right.
That's not exactly bad.
That's written here. So he decides to go to Berkeley and to do his PhD in urban planning. But before that, he spends 10 months drifting in Asia, which is the 4th chapter, which is a fascinating story. I mean, this could be a novel in itself, quite frankly, what he actually did. What impressed me was the ability of, he just packed his bag, got a ticket, and off he went to Thailand, and off he went to Nepal, traveled around India, met people, traveled with them, and you met some pretty interesting people there. There was a guy called the Serpent.
Oh, yes, I met him. I didn't like him that much, but spent a little bit of time with him.
Yeah, well, I'll tell the story. This is a serial killer who took years to find. In fact, David was involved 10 years later, providing information to Interpol that actually pinpointed where this guy actually was. He was a minerals trader, a gem trader.
Well, he represented himself as a gem trader.
And he travelled around those countries, and they couldn't tie him down to any place. But it was David's evidence that actually led to him being arrested. And
not arrested, kept in jail. Richard Neville and his wife Julie wrote a book on suffrage, and I talked to him about, and he was appealing and about to win the appeal, and so we both agreed I should give evidence, and it was that evidence that I could prove that I had stamp on the passport and the diary. I actually had a diary entry about this alarm that I'd met. He used a different name. And had I not, had I accepted his invitation, he sent around a driver 3 mornings to my hotel saying, let's go up to China Wall. We talked about it, the new road. Let's go and have a look. And I didn't like him that much. He seemed a bit of a playboy. We'd been gambling at the Oberoi Casino, which was awful in Kathmandu when you want to understand this wonderful medieval city. So a couple of days later, some Dutch people went up there and they were killed and mutilated. And so I only found out about that about a year later when I was reading a book about him.
So thorough, again, this comes out in everything that David does. How many of you have got your airline tickets from 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Oh, no, it wasn't the ticket, it was the seat number.
The seat number. Oh, the seat number. Sorry, the seat
And
number.
the passport with the stamp on it.
Yeah.
And he was very generous. He said he offered to swap places with me so I could see the Himalaya as we flew by. Just charming at that level.
Yeah. So after 10 months, he moved around. He went, caught up with friends in London and so on, and went to California. And on the east side, is that where you actually?
I'm sorry?
On the east side was where you first lived.
East Bay.
East Bay, I should say.
Yeah.
And in that chapter, he tells the story of what it was like, the homelessness, how things were pretty difficult. So here he was, you know, with all excited to be doing this, and he arrives in this part of San Francisco and sees what's going on. Now, you got involved with the New Left group. You joined a group called Cap State.
I think that was a group of intellectuals writing about the theory of the state.
Yeah.
But the group I was really active in was the East Bay Alliance, which is a Marxist-Leninist pre-party formation. Socialist Revolution in California, couldn't see it.
And you were still carrying around Das Kapital in your back pocket, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely, in which I'd written my dreams. So that actually Carolyn, who's here, stayed with us in California in those days, and
Debbie and Ricky and
it was
Gianni.
a multicultural house in an area, a wide area, where the residential tenant entitlements to the land, but Black people and Jews. It was still on the books. And a lot of them still are on the books in the US. They've never been expunged. They've just been invalidated by law.
The interesting thing for me was that my first sabbatical was at San Francisco State University in public administration. You were there. I haven't told you that. And I went there. My partner at the time went to Stanford and worked with important people there. And I would catch the BART from up into San Francisco State University and so on. And the great Aaron Vildavsky.
Yes,
If you remember him, some of you public policy people might remember him. He came over and gave a seminar at San Francisco State, and he heard this Australian this young guy in the audience, and he said, "Oh, you must come to Berkeley because they have this fabulous log cabin for the staff where they have lunch and so on." And the reason why he was interested was because he did his postdoc at Sydney University.
And his great paper was, if planning is everything, maybe it's nothing.
That's right. So as a public policy scholar, I'm interested in planning from an institutional governance point of view. You can see these connections all the time. That's great. Now, tell us a little bit more. You went to Cuba.
Oh,
How
well,
did you
it was
go
a
via
choice.
Canada?
Yeah, it was a choice. I had an offer from the OECD, but in Paris, but they weren't going to pay me. Okay, living in Paris. And so when will I ever go to Cuba? And the US was warming to Cuba. So I went down to Cuba and on Carnival night in Santiago de Cuba, a friend from the delegation and I went out on the street. So it was the night before Carnival, we thought. It was wonderful. The streets were alive and jumping. There was music everywhere. It was Carnival. We got the time wrong. And that person was Vivian Lin, whom I later married back in Berkeley. So it was, pivotal going to Cuba.
Made the choice. Yeah.
And they've made some very bad choices, Cuba, but my heart is still with them around they should have really taken the path of self-reliance, not the path of integration into the Comecon sugar for oil business.
So finishes his studies, and John Patterson, who he had worked with in Dirge, was involved with planning in the New South Wales Department of Environment and Planning. And as David says, my days of freedom are over. I was back in the fray. So he's back there working with John Patterson. And this is where I guess you came back into working with Pat Troy as well in terms of Peter.
Yeah, we're in Sydney. My job was Central Policy Division of the Planning Ministry. Pat Troy was an advisor. These were Labor days, the Rand government, etc. And the idea was to do metropolitan planning and the urban development program for expansion of Sydney and urban consolidation and wards. And that was fun.
Yeah, look, it's a great read because Pat Troy's interest was against consolidation because he valued the backyard. Whereas Peter Newman, who was the Commissioner for Sustainability, was more concerned about cars on the road. And I guess they were both right. But it was the way in which they ran the debate, how they actually...
And if you can't find him in the book, I call him Peter Newton. John picked up a typo.
Yeah, so that was... then this is where the international work started, through, I guess, Vivian's connection with China and the Australian Institute of Urban Studies.
Vivian's connection was helpful, but that was my initiative just to get AIUS. We did that on our own, but Vivian provided the host at the other side, which is Science and Technology Commission.
Yeah, and this really started, I guess, the long journey, which continues because David, as he was introduced by Eleanor, you could see that that's what he's continuing to do. The bureaucracy of Sydney got him in the end. He felt boxed in by administrative structures and had little power to change. So,
well, I lost my job. Only in the sense that I was spending more time with the Victorians, Brian Howe and Andrew McCutcheon in Melbourne. They're brilliant people. And I was transplanting the urban development program to Sydney into Melbourne for them. Yeah. And when I was away, I'd circulate. I was responsible for metropolitan plans for Sydney, and I circulated to our executive a draft plan while I wasn't there to defend it at the executive. And the knives came because the urban policy people were seen as disloyal to the people, the statutory planners who ran the department, whose God was the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act from New South Wales, right? So I was done over. So I came back, and we didn't have a central policy division anymore. I was now planning division south. I ran the south of the state for planning, which was much more statutory and.
But he was involved, as he said, in Victoria as doing advisory work, consulting work. And on the basis of that, networking again, is a great networker. He was offered the job of Dean of Environmental Design and Construction at RMIT and the start of 17 years there through an incredibly tumultuous time in terms of the Working Men's College moving to be a world-class university, amalgamating. The university tried to amalgamate with the Western District.
We didn't try. They tried to amalgamate us.
And then I love this story. They amalgamated with the Philippine Institute of Technology, which had a site in Bundoora. And I remember when I was at La Trobe, because on one side of the road you've got RMIT, and the other side of the road you've got La Trobe. And this is a great story because one of the lecturers, Dr. Chu, is it?
Yeah.
Who who ran classes or programs in Vietnamese studies for the Philippine Institute of Technology, were some of the key drivers gaining access to in Vietnam years later when they actually set up RMIT International in Vietnam. That's accurate too?
Yeah, I mean, we speak truth tonight. The Chancellor and the Chair of RMIT Vietnam, and Tricia Russler, who ran RMIT Vietnam in Vietnam. So I can't gild the lily tonight.
Oh, please do.
Oh, yeah, and others.
Yeah. So the interesting things that happened. So all of this issues around university amalgamation. I was at the Canberra CAE at the time. We had issues whether we would amalgamate with the ANU. Some parts did, some parts didn't. I went to La Trobe when it is a university, but when I got the story there about all the amalgamation. These are incredibly, well, dramatic and challenging things that universities go through. And I've never been a dean. I've always said no to any of those things. I wanted to be a researcher. That was my thing. But I have great respect for Dennis Gibson's and David Wilmoth, who actually ran the gauntlet of all of that work. It is quite enormous. When you talk about, at one stage, I think 48% of the population living in the city of Melbourne were foreign students. I think
Were students.
Were students. I think at the
That
peak here.
foreign, but not only.
Oh no, okay, yes, thank you. About 46,000 international students at RMIT was at its height. At its height. Just get your head around those
that's
figures.
Also at RMIT offshore.
Oh, okay.
International.
Yeah, what would be the number in the city?
Of RMIT.
Two-thirds of that.
Oh no, Melbourne and others also.
Yeah.
I don't know what the number is.
Yeah, but they're big numbers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you can actually see that given
a gotcha moment, right?
given the pandemic, what it did to our universities all over the country in terms of working with their foreign students. So what have I got here? Now, where am I? I've got which chapter am I up to now?
Oh, you can jump the rest. It's all right.
Yeah. So, drifting in Asia. Here we are. California, rough and tumble. Help building a university. Yes, I've done it. Well, there was an issue there there was tragedy around the AMS issue. They had if I understand it correctly, the university had changed its administrative system, but it didn't ghost the old system with the new systems. And when they came to realise that there had been some fees that weren't paid, the university had lost a lot of money. Would that be a reasonable?
It went live on 2 enterprise systems at the same time, and the transaction load was too complex. Dual sector, massively different systems, and it was just and difficulties with the extraordinary, huge, Australia's biggest university when you look at both sectors. And so it crashed.
And the tragedy is people's lives, people literally died.
Oh, not as a result of it.
Well, when you read the book, the stress that people were suffered.
There's a lot of stress.
Left me with the feeling that, that would have been a contributor, the tragedy of that. But to their credit, people making an extraordinary effort to get it right, which is what's great. Yeah. So, there was.
That's when Dennis joined.
Yes.
RMIT.
Dennis was the chancellor.
Help come out of it.
Yeah. So, and I've got some figures here. Chapter 8, internationalising the working man's college. So the university did much more than simply taking foreign students into their courses here. They changed the courses. They sent Australian students offshore. They tried to build equity into that internationalisation, which I hadn't realised, having worked at RMIT, what we actually went on. I remember the Globalisation Institute. I did some work with them as well. But so this was an important effort that the university actually made. The university established a campus in Penang. That's an interesting story. David tells that whole story, warts and all. That didn't work. And I think it's fair to say that the Malaysian counterparts didn't come good in the day, the money. Is that true?
Absolutely.
That's the situation, and therefore
There was Asian financial crisis at the time, so but they didn't fess up to the way they'd financed the venture, and the lesson we learned was that don't enter into a joint venture where you're a minority partner, where the majority partner isn't transparent around what they bring to the deal.
So there were a number of other countries involved with RMIT, but the next venture was Vietnam, and I've got people who are intimately involved with it. That actually, from the book, I can see that started well before Chuck Feeney and the Atlantic Philanthropies.
Oh, well, that's why he joined us, because we showed the courage to go and set up anyway.
Yeah, so we're talking, I think if I remember the numbers, it's about 5 years from the time that RMIT started with establishing, negotiating, working with the Vietnamese government, the universities, the Hong Kong, the Vietnamese National University, and so on. I mentioned Dr. Chu, key player, who worked with David and David Beanland into that as well. They had an agreement in '98. Sites involved landmine clearing, relocation of family graves.
Well, we have the landmine clearer present tonight.
Oh.
Hello.
Ken.
I'm glad you're here, Ken. Well, there you are, you got to mention. Yeah. So
And more, and much more, campus development.
yeah, extensive legalistic procedure. I mean, I don't know how you did all those negotiations to and fro, involving the World Bank, the ADB, and so on. But in the chapter, there's a fabulous section where a friend calls, and Ron Clark and David has to actually tell his staff at RMIT that this was in fact, a famous runner from Victoria who had a resort at the top end on North Stradbroke Island, which we'd actually been there in Ron Clark's day with him. Anyway, Ron Clark had a friend, and this friend was this chap called Chuck Feeney, which many of you will know about because he's also been very influential here in Brisbane in terms of health research and so on. And if I understand it rightly, that you don't find Chuck Feeney, Chuck Feeney finds you.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what happened with
He read about
RMIT.
us in a magazine in a coffee shop.
Yeah. So RMIT meets with Chuck, and he'd seen the budget. He'd done his homework and so on. And the RMIT, I'm not too sure just who it was at the time. It was
David Beanland and I met with him.
And they were thinking that Chuck was going to give them $130,000. Chuck said, "No, look at the line above, 15 million."
Oh my
Yeah, that helped us. Well, we did have finance for it otherwise, but it was there were hooks on the finance, so it wasn't all plain clearing. So that equity,
yeah,
and that was a gift to RMIT, not to RMIT. So RMIT was able to manage the request in a way that we could.
And they organised the finances, so they had control of them and so on. What was it? The only picture of Chuck Feeney in the book is a man in very casual clothes walking past dilapidated student accommodation. You can't take his photo. He didn't.
Oh, he was shy,
Very shy.
and reclusive, and wouldn't like photos.
Yes, yeah. And would slip away from meetings. No, I don't need all that bullshit. I'm out of here. It was the image I get of Chuck Feeney. So that was the other thing that was interesting was that this opportunity came RMIT's way, but I get the sense that the Victorian government were laggards. They dragged the chain in so many ways that your battle was not just with the Vietnamese government, but just with the Victorian government.
Yeah. Well, Tricia knows the story well. It took 3 weeks for us to change the site in Ho Chi Minh City with the support of the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City. It took a year to get approval from the state government for us to accept the gift, because the gift was leveraged with loans from the World Bank and the ADB. And Victoria, although was at the time, Victoria was a pace setter in PPPs and nifty financial instruments, but they assumed that the whole of the risk of the venture was on our RMIT, thus them the owners, thus them the Commonwealth State Loan Agreement. And it wasn't, it was project finance, so that the project itself carried almost all of the risk, but the Victorians couldn't get it, so the minister took a year virtually to approve it. Drove us mad.
the other connection with me was that my first few years after an AFS student, I was in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And one of my colleagues was Michael Mann, who was my age. And he had gone on to be an ambassador and various things in Southeast Asia. And when I met him, I made that connection with him, with a few people. And he was absolutely fantastic to me because he explained so many things very quickly. And he had my confidence that he was a real asset.
And Michael was I sort of got it going as a sort of interim CEO, but Michael was a safe hand and reassuring and was able to bring the council and others with him. I was always a little bit of risk prone. And so Michael kept it on a steady keel, and the venture was very successful. It's the biggest, or was then until recently, and I'm sure still is now, the biggest branch campus in the world. 6,000 students. It really has worked very well.
It's 7:15 and we promised you 7:20, and there's a few more chapters which I should do a quick summary of, really. I think he talks about learning cities, and he was involved with networks in Melbourne, the University of Melbourne, the City of Melbourne, the state government and so on, about, it's more than just bringing students to the university. It's actually, well, how does this change the nature of Melbourne? What do we do around that? Everything from where the students live, what's the nature of development and so on. He then gives little vignettes related to places that he's been. Palapay in Botswana, Monrovia in Liberia, Gujarat in India, Port Moresby in PNG, and the ADB and the Aga Khan with higher education in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan and other stans. Which in itself,
Kyrgyz Republic.
Yes, was absolutely fascinating. So, and then the other thing is he's been the chancellor of a university called Torrens University. I was
No. Chair of the academic board.
Chair of the academic board.
Dennis has been the chancellor.
Oh, sorry, Dennis. Well, I have to tell you, I'll give you some feedback. I was recently at a conference, and a recent PhD from Torrens University. I'm sitting there, and I said, "Oh, where the hell is Torrens University?" Didn't know where it was. And this woman was outstanding. And I thought, that is fantastic.
Well, they're in Brisbane.
Well, this woman was in Adelaide. She was in Adelaide. Yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of feedback as well. But you did that one very well. I think Michael Mann's involved with that as well.
Yes, Michael was Chancellor post Dennis, and Michael had just retired from that. So the show moves on.
So we will come to the last two chapters, governing cities. It's very reflective, because one of the things he reflects on is that throughout his whole career, that governance is such a central theme here in terms of what I actually do and what I've done. And while he might have been, thinking about urban planning and economics and so on, he comes to a conclusion that the governance of these institutions, these places, is just so important. I think that's a really good chapter and a really important chapter for you to share with the graduate students when you get back to actually doing that. He uses Schumpeter's creative destruction idea through the book, and he reflects in the last chapter on his initial cross-cultural encounter as a 17-year-old student and so on. David became the chair of AFS of Australia in 2019 and had the very difficult task of actually mothballing AFS. Liquidating it. Well, he does in fact say there is certainly a group of us around who would love to see it continue, but it became insolvent. And New York actually said that's it, so it can't run. The way AFS works these days, it's a country-to-country contracts. Okay, it's not to America exclusively and America to the rest of the world, which is what we all did. It's a big business. And when you're negotiating with state departments of education about how many students you can bring in, it's a function of how many they let out. So it's the politics of that are quite extraordinary, and David had a lot to do with finishing that. David's story is not only one of good luck, the serpent, avoiding things, unfortunate choices.
That was good judgment, mate.
Thank you. This is my little summary here, David. So it is also the story of a curious individual who demonstrated values which come out of his early political, Marx, and spiritual Buddha explorations. These have guided him throughout his career and which makes this memoir an interesting and uplifting read, especially for anyone seeking a career in university education and international relations. So thank you, David. Can you please join me in thanking David? And thank you. And we're now going to have some questions. So who would like to ask David a question? Want me to give them the microphone?
Yeah, I'll
You can
take
do
it around.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody got a question, guys? Don't be shy.
I've got a question.
There you go.
David, it's really challenging times now with communities and society having to develop and change to an electrified community, you know, power sources and that. How well equipped and how ready are we to make such fundamental changes in how we do things?
I don't think I have any particular wisdom on that. If by that you mean electricity, as distinct from electronics, we've heard so much. We have such great potential, and we can certainly transform our energy. We've had energy plans knocked back years and years. Let's hope from here on there can be some sort of energy consensus and plan to shift to renewables and a sustainable form. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
No, I have no particular wisdom on that matter.
Yeah, I have a question. I've just finished reading a book, A City with a River Problem. No, A River with a City Problem, I should say, by Margaret Cook.
Oh, yes.
And I'm interested to hear that you're talking about urban development and also the Mekong Delta and so on. And it seems to me that's really been fraught with such infighting of developers and governments, and way back to when the Aborigines told the white people in 1890s, don't live there on the river, that the big fella flood come up, sort of thing. So I'm just wondering what comments you have about what can be done about the development on the floodplains in cities.
Well, thanks, Kerry was an AFS mate from 64, 65 from Queensland. And I don't have any special wisdom other than that we should be more courageous around removing urban development from flood-prone lands. And if that means public acquisition, and also the trouble is that with displacement, there's a whole lot of grief for lost homes and in some cases lost people. And so it's very hard to override that with a Darwin-style solution. But nevertheless, I think planners generally, urban planners, regional planners, have been too timid in promoting the cause. And that's because most of urban planning and regional planning are sort of paralegal professionals who regulate development, who aren't promoting in a way that people did in the perhaps the 60s, 70s, optimal patterns of settlement. So a lot more to do, but it does need the power of public acquisition to get flood-prone land back into more natural sequence. Now, I don't know whether that means relocating Lismore or finding, you know, there are lots of local solutions, but the pushback against it is so strong from grieving families and people from events. It's hard to do.
Can I just give you a lead on that? There's a fabulous, thanks David, there's a fabulous book called Rising from the Flood, which is the story of the relocation of Grantham, which you all know about in the Lockley Valley, and the story of Steve Jones, the mayor. And that's a story of leadership. That's what it takes.
Okay.
Yes.
Take it on.
So is it on?
Yes, it is.
So first of all, a little comment about Grantham. I went to Grantham State School for most of my primary school, and my family owned a dairy farm and cattle property and timber plantation on the headwaters of that little creek, which my grandfather, who owned even more land up there, referred to as that little mongrel of a creek, because it came up very quickly and went down very quickly, and we went up into the Toowoomba Ranges and got a lot of rain that other places didn't get. So I remember school days of having to ride in a bucket across that very same creek so I could hop onto a trailer drawn by a Fergie tractor to to go to school. But that's just a little by the by. But what I wanted to ask David was, you know, I hadn't realised quite what you meant by learning cities until you explained there. And so what I'm wondering is, with COVID, we've seen the absence of international students in our learning cities throughout Australia. Now, do you think that there's any possibility that with changes to the way we interact with our learning, with more off-campus learning, with more fewer interactions between students and their lecturers, that's actually going, what changes do you see that makes to the face of the learning cities?
Well, it's a good question. The core concept of learning cities has many different interpretations, but the international movement is around urban places where people learn from tacit contacts and programs that aren't accredited, as well as from formal education institutions. And the cities are, you know, RMIT in Melbourne, for example, spills its campus out through the city. The library is full of students, the university is full of citizens of Melbourne. So that's the concept. With COVID and the restrictions on contact face-to-face, we have moved a step down the path towards digital dispersal of urban concentrations. I mean, when I did the Marxist thesis long ago, I argued that communications technology intensifies business districts of cities because it removes all the back offices and enables all that face-to-face. I really do now think, with a liking for more flexible work patterns and work at home and offices being more flexible for those who can do it, and many can't, that we are going to see more dispersed patterns. That means that, but the learning resources that are in people's hands now are astronomical compared to back in the 70s when I did that thesis. And so learning cities is still I mean, it can mean many things, but it's still a driving concept. And you look at the neighbourhood a lot of neighbourhood and district organising, which is the way we have to make our cities in the future, is digitally enabled. So we're still, despite the globalness of digital communications, it's actually a very strong tool for district and neighbourhood organisation. And we're going to see that stronger and stronger. To make our cities resilient, we do need more self-reliant districts in cities with infrastructure and with jobs, and you know, not to be reliant upon connections that are metro-wide. If that makes sense.
The New York borough kind of idea.
Yes, perhaps, yeah. And the biggest problems those cities are work-job imbalance, and if we can make those balances better by creating more employment and living spaces within districts, you know, and if COVID kicks us along that path a little bit, all the good.
Brian.
Might make this one last question.
David, one of the most significant challenges we face is the governance of metropolitan regions. We have a system of highly competitive local governments that seem unwilling to collaborate and to address issues around flooding and climate change. What your viewpoint is of this model of a more collaborative form of governance, particularly in metropolitan regions?
Well, thanks. It's a good question. And the elephant in the room is that the state governments are de facto metropolitan planning agencies because they have a lot of the infrastructure and financing and other powers. So it's very, very hard to create a metropolitan governance framework in Australia other than by vesting it, by assigning it to the state. I think Vancouver has done well in the sense that there is an autonomous assembly of local authorities that have powers, finance powers, and they can do transit planning and so forth, and a relatively weak provincial metro planning agency. one of our people in New South Wales now runs that, so I hope she's not alone there. Like Chris. I'm not saying that's the model, but we need a stronger metropolitan voice, and we've shied away from it in Sydney and Brisbane City Council by being so overbounded by development. What used to be a great model is getting less and less relevant. SEQ frameworks have come and gone, but something like that, and Sydney and Melbourne have in recent years experienced. Sydney with the Greater Sydney Commission, could have done it, but they've now tucked it under the planning minister. It needs to be whole of government, government-wide, and with some independence. I don't go for a totally independent metro authority as a commission or anything. There needs to be some ministerial responsibility, but that responsibility has to not be subject to the whims of a planning minister, in my mind. So I don't know if I've answered it as well as we might, but metro governance is something that we could spend a few days on or more, as we do.
Alrighty, I think that's a great place to leave it. So just another round of applause for David and John. Thank you. So there's plenty of copies available inside, and we'll bring you in and get you signing some books.
And is the bar still open?
Absolutely it is. Of course.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for that. That was fun.
Well,